The Mockingbird media is going to have to go do what they did for Jimmy Carter to Joe Biden. And the Mockingbird media has worked so hard at pretending that Jimmy Carter was a great guy. They have so forgotten the hostage crisis. They've so forgotten the gas lines. They've so forgotten how much ruin Jimmy Carter brought onto this country with his ineffective non-leadership and with his kowtowing. And afterwards, they pretended that he was the great, quiet diplomat who didn't do anything untoward, well, except for the fact, of course, that he was writing letters to world leaders saying, ignore Republican presidents, begging them to not go along with what our country had done at an electoral basis. They needed to do everything they could to rehabilitate Jimmy Carter, and they're going to try to do the same thing with Joe Biden, but they're beginning with trying to rehabilitate themselves, and it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in the history of media, because it involves some of my very favorite people who are the intellectual eggshells of the liberal world, meaning, man, they look so strong and so put together on the outside, but you tap on their shell and they crack apart and they come out there yolk-like brains. Well, not in the real sense. I don't wish any harm on them, but they're eggshells. They're empty air. I'll show what I mean here in a second. See, you have to mean what you say and say what you mean and be consistent and not have to turn around and pretend that you didn't know what was going on when everybody else did. You got to be able to do that. Look at the consistency of my friend Zach Abraham, Chief Investment Officer, Bulwark Capital Management. He's been warning about what we're going through now for about a decade. So what am I referring to? A divorce from the performance of companies and their stock prices. This matters. Because when you can have a company trading at 10 to 12 to 20 times earnings and their revenues are flatlining or growing at 1% to 2% per year, when that's happening, you have a divorce from reality and what people are putting their money into. Now, that can work for a long time. People are inventing and investing in pretend value. That can work for a long time until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you're talking about a drop and ruin for people. That's the risk. This year began with a signal, in my mind. Risk. 2 terrorist attacks in the first day of 2025. I think the world intends chaos upon President Trump. They do not want him to get a footing. They do not want his programs to succeed. And I think our enemies, domestic and foreign, are willing to do anything they can to derail him. That could include a precipitous drop in your retirement account, particularly if it's dedicated to made-up value. So simply take this free offer. A conversation. Zach Abraham will look at your investment profiles, all your money. He'll look at where you sit in terms of retirement. Is it a wish, a dream, or an actual plan? And he will tell you in a loving and specific way whether you're actually ready to retire. It's free. There's no obligation and no feelings are hurt if you say, hey, you know what? I'm going to stay where I'm at. If you decide to work with him, great. Here's how to sign up. Just go to knowyourriskradio.com and tell them you want a free, no obligation review of your portfolio. Knowyourriskradio.com or call them at 866-779-RISK. Investment advisory services offered through Trek Financial LLC and SEC registered investment advisor. Investments involve risk and are not guaranteed. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Trek 24-378. Matt Iglesias, one of the most, let's say, self-deluded of all the liberal so-called journalists, wrote this on social media. I thought Joe Biden was going to prove his doubters wrong at the big debate. I know that ever since that humiliation, the whole world thinks the entire media was in a massive cover-up. But the fact is, many of us, and seemingly many members of his team, genuinely thought the situation was better than it was. In a lot of ways, it's been more embarrassing to have been gullible and wrong when so many people with no sources and no inside info could see it clearly. But that's what happened. I was just wrong in one of the biggest questions of the year. It was because we didn't have sources and we didn't have inside info that we saw this, Matt, because we actually trust our own eyes, our own skepticism. You live in a bubble of bubbles. You live in and around Washington, D.C., the Acela Corridor. When my friends came to a meeting, one of my employees came to a meeting late because I'd said the meetings begin at 7:07 in the morning when I took over as the chief digital strategist at the RNC. Before I ever began the job, I said meetings begin at 7:07. You can be late once, and after that, you're done. And you have to warn us that you're going to be late. There is no acceptance for no warning on being late to the morning meeting. It's an important tone-setting meeting. One guy was late once, and when he wasn't let into the meeting, he walked away and had to wait around to talk to me until 5:30 at night, at which point I basically told him that's one strike, no more. Matt Iglesias lives in a world where this stuff is expected. That guy lived in a world where it was okay to be late to meetings. Staff meeting begins at 8 or so, and you kind of straggle in after you make sure that you got your coffee warmed. Oh, I forgot my cream. I'll be right there. Got to go to the bathroom. Matt Iglesias lives in a world where you don't talk about things like this. You live on the team D, and blue is a very, very pretty color. Red's an ugly color. So you live on team blue, and all things with team blue are good, and everybody knows they're lying. But when you do that long enough and you lie with the crowd to maintain your membership in the crowd, you eventually don't know it's a lie anymore. And watching this happen with the Mockingbird media, watching them now go back and try to make sense of what went on is amazing. This is CBS News.
One of the things we also do in the year-end correspondence roundtable is dig into what was undercovered or underreported. Jan?
Undercovered, underreported. That would be, to me, Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline that became undeniable in the televised debate.
At the presidential debate with Donald Trump.
Unquestioned. And, you know, it's starting to emerge now that his advisors kind of managed his limitations. It's been reported in the Wall Street Journal for 4 years, and yet he insisted that he could still run for president. We should have much more forcefully questioned whether he was fit for office for another 4 years, which could have led to a primary for the Democrats. It could have changed the scope of the entire election. Yeah. Yet, still, incredibly, we read in the Washington Post that his advisors are saying that he regrets that he dropped out of the race. You know, that he thinks he could have beaten Trump. And I think that is either delusional or they're gaslighting.
President Biden
She's been a reporter in and around Washington, D.C. for a decade. She's one of their senior people. Her name is Jan Crawford. I wrote this to her on Twitter. I tweeted her. Hi, Jan R. Crawford. Thanks for saying that, but this wasn't underreported. It was self-censored by your bosses. Since Biden was installed in the White House, I've called him the figurehead. Many of my colleagues did similar things. We, conservative media, did your jobs. My producer in this program, Alex, will remember that I used to call him Joe Biden's dementia. Every time I addressed him, it was Joe Biden's dementia. Until an order came down from the top, you can't call him Joe Biden's dementia anymore. I pushed back at the program director and said, no, that's the nickname I've chosen. He said, trust me, it's not going over like you think it is. A reminder that the board of directors of Bonneville Communications, owned by the Mormon Church, has an average age of 72, and they listen. Oh. I thought about that. They were actually really good owners until the speech codes came along. It's their thing. I don't have any disparaging comments to make. It's their company. They can do what they want. But he's right. They were an average of 72 years old. So since then, and it was a good point, actually. Since then, I've made a point. Look, there's plenty of 72-year-olds who are better mentally than I am. I have a friend of mine who's 74. He's better mentally than I am. The figurehead's not. He's sick. He is demented. Watching them try to peel this back has been incredible. Journalists feared being accused during an election year. This comes from Semaphore Media. It's clear the best reporters in Washington have failed in the first duty of journalism, to hold power accountable. It's our duty to poke through the White House smokescreen and find out the truth. The Biden White House clearly succeeded in a massive cover-up of the degree of the president's feebleness and his serious physical decline, which may be simply the result of old age. Shame on the White House press corps for not having pierced through the veil of secrecy surrounding the president. Obviously, the president's decline was a super hard story to report, even by those who wanted to get it, like the Wall Street Journal. This story did not deliver, using mostly named GOP sources. But I do think if enough reporters had pushed, the story was reportable. I worry that too many journalists didn't try to get the story because they did not want to be accused of helping to elect Donald Trump. I get that. The story continues. But this is no excuse for abandoning our first duty, which is to report the truth and hold power accountable. President Biden should be held accountable for his obvious lapses of mental acuity, even if there are periods of lucidity. It's simply astounding for the entire country, including its most seasoned reporters, to be shocked as everyone was by the ugly and painful reality of Biden's debate performance. And it's laughable and immoral for Democrats to blame the press now for overreacting to the reality. The reports of how Biden was are certainly not exaggerated, nor are the reports of Democrats in panic. Jill Abrams wrote that. She was the executive editor of the New York Times from 2011 to 2014, and she wants to tell us she was stunned. Was anyone in this audience stunned to learn that Joe Biden ran nothing? I don't know how you could be, because if you were, you had to be plenty annoyed by me calling him the figurehead and saying every time we spoke about policy, the people who run Joe Biden caused him to sign this document. NBC News. They are happily, busily trying to resuscitate the reputation of the deceased Jimmy Carter. May God rest him. They're going to need to do the same thing to figurehead Biden. This is Lester Holtz.
And the Camp David Accord showed Carter at his best, idealistic, tenacious, leading marathon talks between Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin, achieving a peace treaty that is still in place today. But closer to home, Carter's inexperience and his distaste for political rough and tumble became serious handicaps. And when the economy tanked, so did Carter's popularity. He seemed to blame Americans themselves.
The erosion of our confidence in the future.
He looked weak, photographed collapsing during a run. And it got worse. In Iran, scores of Americans were taken hostage.
I'm a candidate for president of the United States.
Ted Kennedy announced he would challenge Carter for the nomination.
So it started with Carter at his best, idealistic, thoughtful. He was a career politician who had never succeeded at much, was somehow whitewashed. He went from small post to governor, again, indistinguishable in any form of accomplishment, somehow handpicked out of the DNC, perhaps because he could deliver the South, what with his ties to the KKK, that was whether whitewashed after that. The expectation of Jimmy Carter from a lot of people was exactly what we saw. Hapless. A bureaucrat's bureaucrat, not a leader in any sense, not inspiring, not driven by vision, not strong. But Holt had to make it appear as if it was some shock, as if there was some debate that maybe Jimmy Carter didn't need to have all these situations befall him. But then there was the policy that Carter was caused to sign on to by people who ran him, just like people ran Joe Biden. Remember this, God warned humankind. You get kings, they're going to steal your kids and your land and your wine and your vineyards, and this. Human wisdom pales in comparison to God's wisdom. Yep, Jimmy Carter said he loved Jesus, and maybe he did. I pray he did. But he did not respect godly wisdom, or he wouldn't have had the policies that he did.